harmonic function. Hello class. So in this video we're going to talk about a concept called harmonic function, which I believe you learned a little bit about last year. I'll talk you through the definitions and I'll also talk you through some of the changes that we're going to have in comparison to what you've already learned. Let's get started. So what is harmonic function? Well, harmonic functions are basically categories that indicate a chord's role within the phrase or within the harmonic progression. We're going to talk about three different categories of harmonic function in this course: tonic, subdominant, and dominant function. You may have called the subdominant function predominant function last year. These categories are based on the most important chords of the key, the 1 chord, the 4 chord, and the 5 chord. And I'm going to call those 3 chords primary function chords. The other chords that you're seeing on screen, which I'll talk about in a sec, I'm going to often refer to those as secondary function chords. So basically within each of our 3 categories, we have multiple chords that can fulfill these roles. In our tonic category, the 1 chord is obviously a tonic chord, thus its name, but the 3 chord and the 6th chord have a lot in common with that 1 chord and can thus function in the same role within the phrase. Similarly, in subdominant, the 2 and the 6th chord can function in the same role as 4. And in dominant, the 7 can function in the same role as 5. Why is that the case? Well, it turns out that the reason that they function in the same category is that they have a lot in common with one another. And specifically, if we take a look at our tonic category, one of the things they have in common are literally notes in common. You can see to the left of the screen that when we're looking in C major, for example, if we're comparing the 6th chord, our first chord, with our 1 chord, the 2nd chord that I have displayed there, they have C and E in common. In other words, 2 of their 3 notes are the same. And because of that reason, we're going to hear them as very similar to one another. You've actually probably already noticed this in ear training class, that when you do harmonic dictation, you have a lot of trouble telling, for example, the 6th chord apart from the 1 chord, or probably very commonly like the 2 chord and the 4 chord are really difficult for you to hear the difference. Again, that's because they only have 1 note different from one another, and they function the same way within the phrase. It turns out there are a lot of other common tone relationships that help to build these categories. So for example, the 1 chord, or C major chord in the middle there, and the 3 chord also have 2 notes in common, this time the E and the G, if we're talking about C major. So 3 can swap in for 1 in certain places within progressions. This holds true for groupings of chords within all 3 categories of harmonic function. So for example, looking at the subdominant, we can see that the 2 chord, our first chord in that category, and our 4 chord, the middle chord shown in that category, they have an F and an A in common. So they're going to sound really similar. The F major chord and the A minor chord to the right of it have the note A and C in common, so they're going to sound really similar. And in dominant function, we can see that the B and the D are in common between those 2 chords in the key of C major. So there is this inherent similarity between these chords. The thing that changes between them is essentially the quality of the chord, whether they're major chords or minor chords or diminished chords. I haven't really indicated this here because I kind of wanted to keep the diagram neutral to whether we're working in major or minor, but we'll talk about that as we go forward in this lesson and in the upcoming weeks. I will very quickly also point out there's 1 chord I haven't actually shown in the dominant category. The 3 chord also has 2 notes in common with the 5 chord, but it's pretty rare that we actually hear this as dominant function. It's more common that that will be heard as tonic function. That also brings up an interesting point in that some of the chords you'll notice fit into more than 1 category. So that 3 chord that I just talked about, but the 6th chord in particular you'll notice appears in both the tonic category and the subdominant category. And that's because in some cases it actually functions as tonic, but in other cases it functions as subdominant. And that all depends where it falls within the phrase. In other words, what chords come before it and what chords come after that. We're going to talk about this in the live session of our class, but just keep that concept in mind. Function is sometimes going to be determined by context. Another very important aspect of harmonic function is just not what chord matches what category, but is also how these categories work within phrases. Tonic function is really all about stability. It reinforces our home key, and it resolves tension if we've got a tension-producing chord before it. So it's going to be the thing that sounds most like the key. Subdominant function is really about connection within the phrase. It's there to extend or lengthen the progression, and it links content. So most often it actually occurs between the tonic and the dominant chord. And then lastly, the dominant function is the function that produces tension. It's the thing that wants to move somewhere. It's unstable and it wants to resolve. So because of that, the most typical ordering that we hear of these things is tonic, moving to subdominant, moving to dominant, and then back to tonic again. So the idea, we've got stability, connection or linking, tension, and then release or resolution. I should point out that this TSDT ordering that I'm talking about, this is really in classical period music that I'm referring to. This paradigm or ordering does actually occur in other repertoires as well, but it becomes less common the further into the 21st century that we get. So for example, if we're talking a lot about modern day pop music, a tonic, subdominant, tonic progression is way more common than the TSDT ordering. And we're going to actually discuss this fairly extensively in week 6 of this course. For now, though, while we're focusing much more strongly on classical period music, or Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven period, we can think of TSDT, tonic, subdominant, dominant, tonic, as being our main referential pattern. So just a note before we move on to talk about some more concrete examples, you probably remember from last year being introduced to these concepts, but I believe last year working out of the Strauss textbook, you were calling subdominant function predominant. In the literature, these two terms are pretty much used interchangeably, but I'm actually going to reserve one for a certain function and one for a different function. So in this course, I'm going to use the term subdominant to talk about the 4-chord, 2-chord, and 6-chord. The reason for that is I'm actually going to be using the term chromatic predominant in Music 293. And I don't want you to mix up the two concepts because they kind of function in two different ways. Subdominant is just that linking function, but predominants, as I'm going to talk about them next semester, are going to specifically be chords that have to go before the dominant. And subdominants don't always have to go right before the dominant, depending on context. The other reason I'm going to use subdominant rather than predominant, I like this idea of really sticking with one letter for each function label. So S is much shorter than PD. So just be aware of that. They mean the same thing. Comparing last year's content to this year's content, I'm just going to use S to represent that. All right, let's move on to an example. You might remember this from the chord labeling video a few videos ago, but let me play it again for you just so you can have it fresh in your mind. So I've gone ahead and I put some Roman numerals on this example for you, just so you can see how some of the chords are laid out. I haven't finished it though, because this is an example that we're going to analyze together on perusal. You'll also notice that what I've done is underneath each Roman numeral, I listed the associated harmonic function. So 5 is dominant function, I put the D symbol underneath. 1 is tonic function, I put the T symbol underneath, and so forth. And I've done that for each of the individual chords here. We'll talk in a little bit about longer harmonic spans and how those get dealt with. But for now, we're just going to match one symbol to one chord. You're going to notice a few characteristic patterns come up when we do this. So I had mentioned a few seconds ago that TSDT was the most common ordering for classical style music. Well, you can see that exactly right here. The 1, 4, cadential 6, 4, and then 6 is TSDT in terms of our harmonic function. Chains of TSDTs are actually super common in this repertoire. So to have one TSDT that then links to another one, you can very often see them back to back with one another. But you'll notice that at the beginning of our progression, we have something that's not TSDT. What's happening here? Well, this particular section is a feature called prolongation, where a harmonic function category gets stretched out for a longer period of time. Because of that, this section will be heard as tonic function overall because the one chord is actually emphasized in various ways. So as we can see right here, it's on our downbeat, and we hear it twice in very short succession. So it's going to sound like a stronger chord because of those two features. And thus, that's going to be the more strongly heard function here. You actually learned about prolongation last year when you learned a lot of your typical voice leading progressions. So for example, when you learned the 1-7-6-1 progression, that's a very similar prolongation to what you're seeing here on the page right now. When you learn the 1-5-1 progression, that was also a prolongation. It's the idea of being able to stretch out a category of harmonic function. So we can think of the concept of harmonic prolongation as essentially a stretching out of a particular harmonic function. There's 3 typical methods by which harmonic prolongation is achieved, and you're going to find these useful to use in your own composition. So let me walk you through those now. The first method of harmonic prolongation is to use multiple chords that belong to the same harmonic function. So in my little Roman numeral example that you can see below the box, our 6 chord, our 4 chord, and our 2 chord, all 3 of those are subdominant function chords. So we can put the 3 of them in a row to create a longer zone of subdominant. Last year, you learned that you had to actually use these chords in this particular ordering. I'm going to be a lot more flexible about this year as we start to move on to more modern repertoire. So feel free to break that rule at this point. You don't have to go 6, 4, 2. You can switch up the order on those. Our second method of harmonic prolongation, and probably the most common one that you're going to see, is what I'm going to call the sandwich in this course. I just made up that term. That is not a theory textbook term. But essentially, when I'm talking about a sandwich, I'm talking about sandwiching a second chord between 2 instances of the same. So alternating a chord with a second chord and then moving back to the original chord. So you can see my example here, 1 moving to 5 and then back to 1. Because 1 is on the front and the end of that thing, we're going to overall hear that as a zone of tonic, even though we have this temporary 5 that's happening in the middle. And we can sandwich all sorts of things. So we can do a 1-4-1, for example, a 1-7-1. As long as we're coming back to our original chord, we're going to hear that frame as essentially the stronger function. Our third method is actually a little less common, and I'm going to call this one mini TSDT. So this is the idea that you use chords that belong to a TSDT progression, but you're using them over a very short duration of time. For example, I've got a 1, which is tonic, 2, subdominant, 7, dominant, and then back to 1, tonic. So that creates my TSDT ordering. But for example, if I just had these within a span of a single bar, we're probably not going to hear this as a complete harmonic progression. It's not going to be one of the normal TSDTs. It's going to essentially be like an expanded sandwich because one is at the beginning and one is at the end of it. So we're going to hear this as a region of tonic rather than hearing the distinct independent functions within it. So let's revisit our example that we were just looking at a few minutes ago. Let's have a listen to the first 3 bars of this. So in bar 1, we weren't really sure what was originally going on with those first 4 chords. But now that we know a little bit more about prolongation, we can see that beats 1, 2, and 3 of our first bar is essentially just a tonic sandwich. We start with tonic, we move away to 7, and then we come back to our tonic chord again. And this is a very, very typical use of the tonic sandwich prolongation. This sort of prolongation is really, really common at the beginnings of phrases. It's also really common to see a dominant pickup at the beginning of a phrase. Sometimes we think of that as part of the prolongation. Sometimes we think of it as just a little quick tension resolution before we start the main part of our progression. The other thing you might have noticed looking at the harmonic function labels is that in identifying this prolongation here, this larger region of tonic happening, we see that this generates a larger scale TSDT that actually includes that prolongation. So our little 1-7-1 is our zone of T that then moves SDT afterwards. And this is very, very common. Again, this is the way that we normally have these chained together. So we're going to continue with this analysis on perusal. What I'm going to get you to do is work in small groups to answer a series of questions. You're going to add your Roman numerals onto your score. You're going to add any inversion symbols that you need. I don't have all of them in there, by the way. You're going to have to edit the content that I have here already. You're going to then add your harmonic function labels. And then you're going to try to see if you can find any prolongations. I've also asked you on the perusal exercise to add the non-chord tone labels just so you can get a little bit of practice with that. And you're going to notice that they tend to occur where we have subdivisions of our beat. So for example, when you have eighth notes here, the eighth notes are moving when the chord is not changing. So probably one of the two is going to be a non-chord tone or a chord skip. Thanks for watching this instructional video on harmonic function. We'll continue next with sequences.